Wind howling off rugged Wyoming peaks hides dark secrets, but none matching a stolen home's chilling sting. Following 2 grueling years trapping in bitter wilderness, one grizzled mountain man trudged through deep snow, expecting an empty, ruined cabin. Instead, he discovered warm smoke, a leveled shotgun, and her. The winter of 1874 was merciless, gripping the Wyoming territory in a suffocating hold of ice and biting frost. Caleb Montgomery had spent the last 2 years high in the Bitterroot Mountains, living a life of brutal isolation. He was a mountain man in the truest sense, hardened by avalanches, scarred by grisly encounters, and forged in the absolute silence of the high country. Trailing behind him were 2 heavily laden pack mules, burdened with prime beaver and wolf pelts that would fetch a small fortune at the trading posts in South Pass City. But Caleb didn't care about the money right now. His bones ached with a deep, marrow-chilling cold. All he wanted was the sanctuary of Whispering Pines, the secluded valley where he had built his homestead with his own calloused hands. He envisioned the sagging roof, the overgrown weeds, and the heavy layer of dust he would have to clear out. He had left the cabin entirely abandoned, sealing the door against the elements, expecting to return to the quiet decay of nature reclaiming its space. As he crested the final ridge overlooking his valley, the biting wind whipped his long, unkempt hair across his eyes. He pulled down his scarf, squinting through the falling snow. Caleb froze. His gloved hand instinctively dropped to the cold iron of his Colt revolver. There, nestled in the valley below, was his cabin. But it wasn't a derelict ruin. A steady, thick ribbon of gray smoke plumed from the stone chimney, curling defiantly into the winter sky. The split-rail fence, which had been rotting when he left, was not only repaired but reinforced with fresh pine logs. The corral held 2 sturdy draft horses, their breath pluming in the frigid air. And most jarring of all, a massive pile of freshly split firewood was stacked meticulously against the eastern wall of the cabin, protected from the snow by a heavy canvas tarp. Someone was living in his home. Caleb's jaw tightened. Outlaws? Drifters? The frontier was teeming with desperate men driven west by the panic of 1873, squatting on whatever land they could steal. He tied his mules to a frosted spruce tree at the edge of the timberline, unslung his heavy Sharps rifle, and began a silent, predatory descent toward the clearing. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who hunted for a living, his boots making barely a whisper against the fresh powder. He reached the edge of the cabin, pressing his back against the rough-hewn logs he had felled himself 3 years prior. The savory scent of a venison stew wafted through the cracks in the chinking, making his empty stomach twist. He edged toward the heavy oak door. He didn't plan on asking questions. In the wild, hesitation was an invitation to an early grave. Caleb stepped back, raised his boot, and kicked the door right at the iron latch. The door burst open with a violently loud crack, slamming against the interior wall. Caleb stepped into the threshold, his Sharps rifle leveled at chest height, the hammer cocked back with a menacing double click. "Don't move a muscle," Caleb snarled, his voice a gravelly rasp unused to human speech. But the threat died in his throat. Standing in the center of the room, illuminated by the warm, flickering light of the hearth, was not a gang of hardened drifters. It was a woman, and she had a Winchester repeating rifle leveled squarely at his heart. "Take one more step into my house, mister, and I'll drop you where you stand," she fired back, her voice shaking but laced with absolute, terrifying resolve. Caleb stared at her, momentarily disarmed by the sheer absurdity of the situation. She was in her late 20s, wearing a heavy wool skirt and a man's oversized flannel shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with the lean muscle of hard labor. Her face was smudged with hearth ash, her dark hair pulled back into a messy, practical braid. She didn't look like a pioneer wife. She looked like a survivor backed into a corner. "Your house?" Caleb's eyes narrowed, his finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. "Lady, I felled the timber for these walls. I laid that hearthstone. You are trespassing on my claim." The woman didn't lower her weapon. Her eyes, a piercing shade of hazel, darted over his towering, fur-clad frame. "You're lying." The man who owned this claim abandoned it and died in the Dakota Territory over a year ago. "I hold the deed to this land." "Do I look dead to you?" Caleb growled, stepping slowly into the room to shut the freezing wind out. He kicked the door closed behind him, the loud thud echoing in the tense silence. "The name is Caleb Montgomery, and unless the federal government decided to start auctioning off a living man's property, you've been swindled." For a fraction of a second, the iron resolve in the woman's eyes faltered. The barrel of her Winchester dipped a fraction of an inch as she processed the name. "Montgomery?" she whispered. "Lower the gun," Caleb said, his tone softening just a fraction, realizing she truly believed she belonged here. He slowly uncocked his sharps and lowered the barrel to the floorboards. "I ain't here to shoot a woman, but I want some answers." She hesitated, her knuckles white around the stock of the rifle. Slowly, agonizingly, she lowered the weapon, though she kept her thumb resting near the hammer. "My name is Abigail Prescott," she said, her chest heaving with adrenaline. "And I bought this land, legally, 8 months ago, in Oakhaven." Caleb stepped further into the warmth of the cabin, the heavy scent of herbs and drying meat overwhelming his senses. He looked around. She hadn't just squatted. She had transformed the place. The sparse, utilitarian bachelor pad he had left behind was now a home. There were braided rugs on the floor, mason jars of preserved vegetables lining the shelves, and a heavy quilt draped over the bed. His bed. "You bought it from who, exactly?" Caleb asked, pulling off his frost-covered gloves and tossing them onto the wooden table. "The bank. Oakhaven National," Abigail replied defensively. "Josiah Abernathy, the bank manager. He handled the transaction himself. He said the previous owner defaulted on the territorial taxes and died of cholera on the Bozeman Trail." A cold fury, much sharper than the winter wind outside, began to burn in Caleb's chest. He knew Josiah Abernathy. A slick, pompous man from Chicago who had set up shop in Oakhaven 5 years ago, slowly buying out failing ranches and foreclosing on struggling miners. "I paid my taxes to Elias Higgins at the assayer's office 3 days before I rode into the mountains," Caleb said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "I left him enough gold dust to cover me for 5 years. Abigail took a step back, the horrific realization washing over her face. No, that can't be. I have the papers. I paid $200. It was everything I had." Caleb looked at her, truly looking at her for the first time. He saw the desperation in her posture, the patched elbows of her shirt, the profound exhaustion shadowing her eyes. She hadn't stolen his land. She had been robbed, just as he had. "Show me the deed, Abigail," Caleb said softly. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Caleb sat at the heavy oak table, a steaming mug of black coffee resting near his elbow. Across from him sat Abigail, an uneasy truce hanging in the air between them. Lying flat on the table was the deed. Caleb traced a calloused finger over the heavy parchment. There, at the bottom, was a signature. Caleb Montgomery. "It's a forgery," Caleb said, his voice flat. "It's a damn good one, but I don't loop my M's like that. I broke my hand in a mining collapse in '68. My handwriting is jagged." Abigail stared at the paper, her face pale. It was notarized by Judge Horatio Wilkes. He was right there in the bank. He stamped it himself. Caleb let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Wilkes and Abernathy have been running Oakhaven like their own personal fiefdom for years. But why this land? I'm 20 miles from town. The soil is too rocky for major farming, and the gold streams dried up a decade ago. Why would they go through the trouble of forging a deed and selling it?" Abigail remained silent for a long moment, staring down into her coffee mug. The wind howled against the heavy window shutters, rattling the iron latches. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Because they didn't know I would actually stay," Abigail confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb looked up, studying her face. "What do you mean?" "I'm not from out here, Mr. Montgomery," she began, her hazel eyes meeting his. "I came from Boston. I was fleeing a situation. My husband, Arthur Prescott, was a wealthy railroad magnate. He was also a monster. He beat me within an inch of my life one night, and I realized he was eventually going to kill me. So, I took what little money my mother had left me, snuck onto a midnight train, and ran. She wrapped her hands around her mug to steady them. I needed to disappear. I went as far west as the rails would take me, and then I took stagecoaches the rest of the way. When I got to Oakhaven, I was desperate, exhausted, and naive. I asked the banker for the most remote, isolated piece of property he had. He sold me this. Caleb leaned back in his chair, the pieces slowly clicking together in his mind. Abernathy thought you were a soft eastern city girl. He figured you'd freeze out here, or starve, or get spooked by the wolves and run back east by the first snowfall. He sold you the land, pocketed your $200, and expected the cabin to be empty again by winter. But I didn't leave, Abigail said, a fierce spark of pride igniting in her eyes. I learned how to shoot. I traded my silk dresses in town for seed and a plow. I chopped that wood. I rebuilt that fence. I survived. Caleb couldn't help but feel a flicker of profound respect for the woman sitting across from him. The Wyoming wilderness broke strong men daily. For a society woman from Boston to tame this homestead over 8 months alone was nothing short of miraculous. You did more than survive, Caleb admitted quietly. You kept my home alive. Abigail looked down, a flush of embarrassment rising on her cheeks. But it's not my home. It's yours. And now, I have nowhere to go. I have no money left. If I go back to Boston, Arthur will find me. The desperation in her voice struck a chord deep within Caleb's isolated heart. He had spent his life running away from people, finding peace only in the lonely altitudes of the mountains. But looking at Abigail, he saw a kindred spirit, a soul pushed to the absolute edge, fighting for a patch of dirt to call their own. You aren't going anywhere, Caleb said firmly. Abigail blinked, surprised. What? Winter is fully set in. The pass back to town will be completely snowed over by morning. My mules are exhausted, and I'm half dead from the trail, Caleb said, standing up from the table. You bought this place believing it was yours. You bled for it. As far as I'm concerned, you have as much right to sit by that fire as I do. Mr. Montgomery. Caleb, he corrected. We're going to share the cabin. I'll take a bedroll out in the tack room near the barn. It's insulated well enough. You keep the house. Come spring, we ride into Oakhaven together, and we introduce Josiah Abernathy to the barrel of my sharps. A wave of relief washed over Abigail's face, so profound that she had to quickly wipe a rogue tear from her cheek. Thank you, Caleb. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet, Caleb warned, walking over to the window and peering through a crack in the heavy wooden shutters. The snow was falling thicker now, a blinding white curtain descending over the valley. Because Abernathy is greedy, but he isn't stupid. If he realized you survived the summer, and if word somehow reached town that I came down from the mountains. Caleb's words were cut abruptly short by the sharp, unnatural crack of a gunshot echoing through the freezing valley. The glass of the cabin's front window shattered inward, raining deadly shards across the wooden floorboards. The ceramic mug on the table exploded into fragments as a heavy-caliber bullet buried itself deep into the log wall behind them. "Get down!" Caleb roared, diving across the room and tackling Abigail to the floor just as a second shot tore through the front door, splintering the oak. They scrambled behind the heavy cast-iron stove as the terrifying sounds of men shouting over the howling wind drifted down from the tree line. Caleb grabbed his Sharps rifle from the floor, his heart hammering against his ribs. The solitude of the mountains was gone. The harsh reality of the corrupt world had followed them both to the doorstep. "How many?" Abigail whispered, terror gripping her throat as she reached out and pulled her Winchester toward her, sliding the lever down to chamber a round. Caleb peered around the edge of the stove, staring at the bullet holes in his home, his eyes turned ice cold. "Enough to try and bury us," Caleb muttered, cocking the heavy hammer of his rifle. "But they just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They tried to take my mountain." The heavy lead of a Winchester. 44-40 tore through the iron stovepipe, sending a shower of black soot raining down on Caleb and Abigail. Outside, the howling Wyoming blizzard was punctuated by the rhythmic, terrifying cracks of lever-action rifles. "They're fanning out!" Caleb yelled over the deafening noise, his voice cutting through the panic. He rolled onto his stomach, pushing his Sharps rifle through a gap in the shattered front window. He didn't fire blindly. A mountain man knew the value of lead. He waited, his icy blue eyes scanning the darkening tree line through the driving snow. A shadow moved against the white powder near the corral. Caleb exhaled, steadying his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy rifle roared, kicking back hard into his shoulder. A scream echoed from the pines, followed by the dull thud of a body hitting the snow crust. "Got one," Caleb grunted, quickly reaching for a paper cartridge to reload. Beside him, Abigail didn't cower. She crawled to the adjacent window, her own Winchester gripped tightly in her ash-stained hands. She knocked out a jagged piece of remaining glass with the barrel and leveled it at the barn. "Who are they?" Abigail yelled, her chest heaving as she fired a warning shot at a muzzle flash in the distance. Before Caleb could answer, a booming, gravelly voice echoed from the timberline, amplified by the wind. "Montgomery, we know you're in there," the voice hollered. "This ain't your fight. Toss the Boston woman out the front door, and you can keep this miserable patch of dirt." Abigail froze, her blood turning to ice water. The Winchester trembled in her grasp. Caleb looked over at her, seeing the sudden, paralyzing terror wash the color from her face. "That's Deacon Rollins," Caleb said, his jaw locked tight. "Josiah Abernathy's chief enforcer. He usually handles foreclosures, not midnight assassinations." "It's not Abernathy," Abigail whispered, her voice breaking. She looked at Caleb, her hazel eyes wide with a terror that went far deeper than the bullets flying at them. "Abernathy just wanted the land. But that voice, Deacon just called me the Boston woman." Caleb's mind raced, the pieces violently snapping into place. "Your husband?" Abigail nodded, a single tear cutting through the soot on her cheek. "Arthur must have hired Pinkertons. They must have tracked my train tickets," asked around Oakhaven. "Abernathy didn't just sell my land. He realized who I was. Arthur is paying a bounty for me." $5,000, Montgomery," Deacon Rollins shouted from the dark. $5,000 for the runaway wife, breathing and walking. You send her out, I'll split it with you. You don't, we burn you both to ash." Caleb looked from the shattered window to the woman huddled beside him. She had crossed half the country, rebuilt a ruined homestead with her bare hands, and survived 8 months of crushing isolation, only to be cornered like a trapped rabbit by the ghosts of her past. She lowered her head, the fight seemingly draining out of her. "I'll go," she whispered, her voice deadened with resignation. She began to uncock her rifle. "If I stay, they'll kill you, Caleb. This is your home. You shouldn't die for my mistakes." Caleb reached out, his massive, calloused hand wrapping firmly over the receiver of her rifle, stopping her. "I spent 2 years up on the Bitterroot Divide, Abigail," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I fought off a 600-pound grizzly with a hunting knife to keep my catch. I survived avalanches that buried entire valleys." He leaned in closer, his eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising light. "I don't surrender what is mine, and right now, you are under my roof. That makes you mine to protect." Abigail looked up, her breath catching in her throat at the raw, undeniable conviction in his words. It wasn't possession. It was a vow. "Reload your weapon," Caleb ordered gently. Caleb shifted his weight and bellowed out the shattered window. "Rollins, you want her? Come earn the bounty." A volley of gunfire answered him, splintering the oak door. But the blizzard was worsening. The temperature was plunging well below zero, and the wind was whipping into a blinding whiteout. Caleb knew mountain warfare. Rollins and his men were city thugs and plains drifters. They weren't dressed for a high-altitude winter plunge. "They can't rush us in this snow without freezing or getting shot," Caleb muttered, watching the shadows retreat deeper into the trees. "They're going to try to wait us out, or circle around and light the cedar shingles on the back roof." He turned to Abigail, pulling his heavy buffalo hide coat tight. "Lock the door behind me." Abigail's eyes widened in panic. "Where are you going? You can't go out there." "I'm a trapper, Abigail," Caleb said, checking the edge of his 10-inch Bowie knife before slipping it into his belt. He picked up a coiled length of rawhide rope. "I don't sit in a cage, waiting for the wolves. I go hunt them." The cold hit Caleb like a physical blow as he slipped out the root cellar doors at the rear of the cabin. The wind howled, whipping crystalline snow into his eyes, but he welcomed it. The blizzard was his ally. It masked his scent, his sounds, and his silhouette. He moved through the snowdrifts with terrifying grace, his boots stepping exactly where the powder was softest. He flanked wide, circling around the frozen creek bed toward the heavy timber where Deacon Rollins's men had retreated. Through the blinding white, Caleb spotted a faint, orange glow. 3 of the gunmen had huddled in a shallow ravine, trying to desperately ignite a small fire to keep their hands from freezing off. They were clustered close, their rifles resting against a fallen pine. Caleb dropped low, becoming just another shadow in the storm. He crept up behind the heavy roots of the fallen tree. He didn't use the sharps gunfire would give away his position. He vaulted over the roots with explosive speed. Before the first man could even register the movement, Caleb clamped a gloved hand over his mouth and drove the hilt of his Bowie knife into the man's temple, dropping him instantly into the snow. The second man turned, his eyes wide, fumbling for his revolver. Caleb kicked the man's knee, snapping the joint with a sickening crunch, and followed it with a devastating right cross that knocked the outlaw out cold. The third man scrambled backward, raising his hands in terror. But Caleb simply grabbed him by the lapels of his duster and hurled him headfirst into a snowdrift. "Where is Rollins?" Caleb growled, pulling the gasping man up by his collar, the tip of his knife resting against the outlaw's throat. "Around the front," the man sobbed, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He was getting the kerosene from the saddles. He's going to burn the porch." Caleb dropped the man, leaving him to flee into the blinding storm, and sprinted back toward the cabin. If Rollins lit the porch, the dry logs would go up like a tinderbox, trapping Abigail inside. As Caleb rounded the corner of the corral, he saw a hulking figure wading through the waist-deep snow toward the cabin's front steps, a sloshing jerrycan of kerosene in one hand and a lit torch in the other. "Rollins!" Caleb roared over the wind. Deacon Rollins spun around. He was a massive, scarred man, wearing a heavy bowler hat and a thick wool coat. Seeing Caleb, he dropped the kerosene and clawed for the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Caleb didn't bother drawing his own gun. He charged. Rollins managed to clear leather and fire a wild shot that grazed Caleb's shoulder, tearing through the buffalo hide and biting into the flesh. Caleb didn't even flinch. He hit Rollins like a runaway freight train, tackling the massive enforcer into the deep snow. The torch sputtered out in the powder as the 2 men locked in a brutal, primal struggle. Rollins was incredibly strong, throwing a heavy punch that caught Caleb in the jaw, making his vision swim. Rollins scrambled to bring his revolver to bear, pressing the barrel against Caleb's chest. Before Rollins could pull the trigger, a deafening crack echoed through the storm. Rollins cried out, dropping his revolver as a bullet shattered the frozen wood of the porch railing right next to his hand. Caleb looked up. Standing in the doorway of the cabin, the shattered door hanging on one hinge, was Abigail. The blizzard whipped her hair wildly around her face, but she stood tall, the Winchester pressed firmly to her shoulder, smoking from the barrel. She racked the lever with a sharp, authoritative clack, chambering a fresh round directly at Rollins' chest. "Move," she commanded, her voice cutting through the storm like a blade. Rollins looked at the woman he had come to kidnap, then at the furious mountain man kneeling over him. The enforcer realized he had gravely miscalculated. He raised his hands, his face pale. "Get off my land!" Caleb snarled, pulling himself up from the snow. He grabbed Rollins by the collar and shoved him hard toward the tree line. "You tell Josiah Abernathy that his deed is worthless, and you tell Arthur Prescott that his wife is dead." The winter took her. "If either of you sends men to Whispering Pines again, I will hunt you down all the way to Boston." Rollins didn't say a word. He clutched his bruised hand and stumbled away into the whiteout, disappearing into the raging tempest. Caleb stood in the freezing wind for a long moment, watching until he was sure they were gone. His shoulder throbbed with a burning pain, and his breath came in heavy, ragged gasps. He turned slowly and walked up the steps to the porch. Abigail lowered the rifle, her hands shaking violently now that the adrenaline was fading. She looked at Caleb, seeing the blood seeping through his coat. Without a word, she dropped the gun, stepped forward, and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face into his chest. Caleb hesitated for a fraction of a second, completely unaccustomed to the warmth of human contact. Then, slowly, his heavy arms encircled her, pulling her tight against him, sheltering her from the howling wind. They moved inside, pushing the heavy oak table against the broken door to secure it. The fire in the stove had dwindled to glowing red embers. Abigail immediately went to work, tearing strips of clean cotton from a petticoat and boiling water to clean Caleb's shoulder wound. Caleb sat shirtless by the fire, wincing slightly as she pressed the hot, damp cloth against the bullet graze. Her touch was gentle, a stark contrast to the violence they had just survived. "You saved my life out there," Caleb said quietly, watching her face in the dim light. "You gave me a life worth saving," Abigail replied softly. She finished tying the bandage and looked up, her hazel eyes meeting his. The space between them felt suddenly electric, charged with unspoken words and a profound, undeniable bond forged in the crucible of the night's chaos. "Arthur won't stop," she whispered, the shadow of fear returning to her eyes. "He's a rich man. He'll find out I'm still alive